The glass wall behind me reflected 22 faces: executives, senior managers, two clients who had flown in that morning expecting forecast and confidence, not a public execution. The boardroom was quiet in that expensive, controlled way that only powerful people understand. At the head of the table, Harold Whitmore, my father-in-law and billionaire CEO of Reedwell Global Holdings, closed his leather folder and looked straight at me. "Bianca," he said calmly, "this won't take long. I already knew. 8 years inside this company had trained me to recognize the moment before a decision becomes irreversible. My husband, Daniel, sat 2 seats to Harold's right. His posture was rigid. He didn't look at me. "You are relieved of your role as Chief Strategy Director." Harold continued, "Effective immediately." He paused, letting the words settle. "Due to internal concerns. Security will escort you out once this meeting ends." Someone shifted in their chair. A client cleared his throat. No one spoke. I stood slowly, resting my hands on the table. My heart didn't race. That surprised me. Is this because the Jakarta expansion exceeded projections, I asked? Or because the Berlin acquisition closed despite your objections? Harold smiled faintly. "This is not a discussion." "No," I said evenly. "It's a message." That was when I heard a chair scrape behind me, then another. I turned. Evan Brooks, our CFO, stood first, then Claire Donovan from legal, Marcus Hale from operations, one by one. They rose, 22 people, silent, controlled. They didn't look at me. They walked past me, past Harold, past the clients, toward the door. "What do you think you're doing?" Harold snapped, his composure finally cracking. The last person to leave was my assistant. "Lena!" She stopped, placed a small black flash drive on the table, and said calmly, "Everything." The door closed. I picked up my bag, met Harold's eyes, and said quietly, "You taught me how power works. You just forgot what loyalty costs." Then I walked out. "How are you feeling right now? Honestly, if this moment stirred something in you, take a deep breath, maybe stretch a little. Your body deserves kindness too. Tell me where you're listening from. And if this story speaks to you, stay with me and subscribe. It means more than you think. Because what happened next wasn't loud, but it was carefully planned. The elevator ride down felt longer than it ever had. No one spoke. No one checked their phone. 22 people stood with me in that enclosed steel box. The quiet, thick, but not awkward. It wasn't panic. It was resolve. When the doors opened in the lobby, everyone stepped out at the same time, like we'd rehearsed it, though we never had. Outside, the city moved on as if nothing had happened. Traffic, coffee cups, people late for meetings that still mattered to them. I stopped on the sidewalk and finally turned around. Faces looked back at me, not fearful, not uncertain, just calm. "I didn't ask you to do that," I said. Evan exhaled slowly. "You didn't have to." Claire crossed her arms. Harold thought loyalty was bought. He forgot it's earned, one by one. They spoke, not dramatically, not emotionally, just facts, missed promotions, ideas buried because they didn't come from the right last name, ethical lines bent until they nearly snapped. I realized then that my firing wasn't the beginning. It was just the signal. Daniel called 3 times before I answered. His voice was tight, controlled. "You embarrassed my father." "No," I replied. "He embarrassed himself. You don't understand what you've started." "I understand exactly what I ended." That night, I didn't go home. I went to a small apartment I'd kept quietly for years, my contingency, my private reminder that independence wasn't disloyalty. Lena arrived first, laptop already open, then Evan, then Marcus. Coffee turned cold, screens filled with spreadsheets, contracts, archived emails. This wasn't chaos. This was preparation finally allowed to surface. For months, quietly. Carefully, we had documented everything Harold dismissed as untouchable. Financial reroutes disguised as restructuring, client clauses overridden with verbal approvals, signatures duplicated just well enough to pass casual review. He thought authority erased paper trails. It doesn't. Claire laid out the legal framework. Marcus mapped operational dependencies. Evan traced cash flow patterns that no auditor should ignore. And Lena, who everyone underestimated, had already mirrored servers Harold didn't know still existed. "We don't move yet," I said. "We let him believe he's won." They nodded, because this wasn't about revenge. It was about exposure, as dawn approached. I stood by the window, watching the city wake up. 22 people behind me, still working, still choosing to stay. Harold Whitmore had fired me in front of clients to prove power. What he didn't realize was that power doesn't walk out alone. It gathers, and it waits. If you're someone who looks deeper than most, don't leave. This next part is for you. By mid-morning, the story was already changing. Internal messages went out from Reedwell Global's executive office, carefully worded. Professionally cold. Leadership transition. Strategic realignment. No disruption to client services. Harold Whitmore knew how to manage optics. He always had. What he didn't know was that optics are useless when the structure underneath is already cracked. My phone stayed silent. That was intentional. The team and I had agreed no calls, no emails, no visible coordination. We moved like shadows, separate but aligned. Evan stayed home, logged into systems he still legally accessed. Claire went quiet. Letting legal assume compliance meant obedience. Marcus walked the floor, answering questions without saying anything new. Lena handled the rest. At 10:30 a.m., the first sign appeared. A mid-level director sent a cautious message. Are the Jakarta projections still valid? At 11:15 a.m., a client requested written confirmation that Bianca Reed was no longer attached to their account because their contract referenced my approval authority by name. By noon, Harold's office began to feel the pressure. Daniel finally showed up at my apartment just after lunch. He looked tired, irritated, and unprepared for what he found me calm, composed, surrounded by open files and quiet certainty. "You blindsided everyone," he said. "No," I replied. "I stopped protecting you." He paced the room. "My father is furious. He thinks you orchestrated some kind of mutiny. That would require authority." I said, "I don't have any." "Remember," he stopped. "This isn't over. I know." What Daniel didn't understand, what Harold never understood, was that I'd learned early never to confuse access with control. Being visible inside power makes you predictable. Being underestimated makes you dangerous. By evening, Lena flagged the first internal freeze, a regional payment delayed pending review, then another. Nothing dramatic. Just enough friction to slow momentum. Claire sent a single message, compliance triggered. Quietly. That was the word Harold hated most. Quiet. He built his empire on decisive gestures, big meetings, firm voices, public authority. He didn't know how to fight silence. He didn't know how to counter systems that simply stopped responding. At sunset, I stepped outside onto the balcony, watching the city darken. Phones lit up across windows like nervous signals. Behind me, 22 people were still choosing patience over panic. Harold Whitmore thought he'd removed me. What he'd actually done was remove the distraction. And now, the real work could begin. The first mistake Harold Whitmore made was assuming speed would save him. By the second day, he started moving fast, too fast. Emergency calls, sudden meetings, consultants flown in who didn't understand the company's internal architecture, only its surface numbers. He thought momentum could overpower structure. It couldn't. At 9:40 a.m., Marcus reported that 3 regional directors had been asked to temporarily override standard approval protocols. Each request was framed as urgent. Each one violated internal governance. Claire documented everything. By 11 a.m., Evan flagged a deeper issue. A liquidity bridge Harold had relied on, one that smoothed cash flow between divisions depended on an authorization clause tied to my former role, a detail Harold had dismissed as ceremonial years ago. "Do we trigger it?" Evan asked. "Not yet." I said, "Let him pull harder." Daniel called again that afternoon. This time, his voice wasn't angry, it was uncertain. "Dad says clients are asking questions." He said, "They're nervous." "They should be," I replied. "You're enjoying this." "No," I said honestly, "I'm correcting it." Silence stretched between us. "You could stop this," he finally said. I looked at the documents spread across the table, contracts I'd negotiated, safeguards I'd insisted on, redundancies Harold had mocked as paranoia. "I already did," I said, "a long time ago." That evening, Lena sent a single message to the group: Phase 2 ready. Phase 2 wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve leaks or confrontations. It was simply alignment. Clients whose contracts referenced my strategic sign-off were contacted politely, professionally by Claire, who explained that certain assurances required clarification before renewal. Vendors received compliance questionnaires Marcus had prepared months earlier. Nothing accusatory, nothing aggressive, just process. Harold hated process. By the third morning, his office began leaking stress. Assistants snapping, meetings running long, decisions reversed within hours. The calm authority he projected had fractures now thin, but visible. At 2:15 p.m., Evan sent the message we'd been waiting for. He's locked out, not of the building, not of power, of certainty. The liquidity bridge stalled. The override requests were flagged. A scheduled acquisition paused pending internal review. Every move Harold made now created more friction. That night, I received an email from Harold himself. No threats, no insults, just one line: "We need to talk." I didn't reply. I stood by the window instead, city lights flickering below like a living circuit board. Behind me, the team worked quietly, deliberately, choosing precision over impulse. Harold Whitmore believed control meant commanding people. He was about to learn it meant understanding systems, and he understood neither. The next part is only understood by the truly observant. Don't miss it. Harold Whitmore didn't panic. That was his strength and his weakness. Instead of slowing down, he escalated. By the end of the week, he'd stopped pretending everything was normal. He canceled 2 board sessions and replaced them with executive briefings, carefully limiting attendance. People were no longer invited based on role, but on obedience. That never ends well. At 8:20 a.m. on Friday, Marcus sent an encrypted note: "He's bypassing governance." I already knew what that meant. Harold had decided rules were optional when applied to himself. Emergency spending approvals were pushed through without audit. Legal was sidelined. External advisors were brought in on verbal assurances alone, the kind of shortcuts that look decisive until someone reads the fine print. Claire did. She arrived at my apartment that morning with a single folder, thin but heavy. Inside was a draft memorandum Harold had authorized late the night before, a restructuring clause designed to consolidate authority under the CEO during market instability. "He's trying to legally silence dissent," she said. "If this passes, internal resistance becomes breach of contract." "Can it pass?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not cleanly, but he's betting no one will challenge it." He was betting on fear. Evan joined us shortly after, laptop already open. He projected a flow diagram onto the wall, money moving, approvals stacking, dependencies tightening. "He's pulling capital forward," Evan said. "Short-term liquidity at the cost of long-term exposure." Marcus leaned back. "He's mortgaging the company to prove he's still in control." That was the moment I understood. Harold wasn't trying to win anymore. He was trying not to lose in public. Daniel showed up unannounced that afternoon. He looked different, less entitled, more strained. "You need to stop," he said without preamble. "Dad's preparing to make an example." "Of whom?" I asked. "Anyone still aligned with you." I studied him carefully. "And you?" He hesitated. I don't know where I stand. That's the problem, I said quietly. You never did. He rubbed his face. This is getting dangerous. It always was. I replied, You just didn't feel it until now. After he left, Lena closed the door and locked it. Harold just crossed the line. She said, He authorized an internal data sweep. My expression didn't change. Let him. She smiled faintly. He doesn't know about the mirrors. No, he didn't. Because months ago, when he'd demanded full access to strategic systems, I'd insisted on redundancy, backups, shadow logs, independent timestamps. He'd called it wasteful. I'd called it insurance. By nightfall, the data sweep began servers humming, permissions shifting, digital footprints stirring, and every move he made was recorded. Harold Whitmore believed power meant reaching farther when threatened. He never realized that overreach is how traps close. The data sweep began at 6:40 a.m. Lena noticed it first, not because of an alert, but because of what didn't happen. No confirmation pings, no completion logs, just activity without closure. The kind that looks successful until you trace it. He's pulling everything into a single access tunnel, she said, eyes fixed on her screen, trying to centralize. That's reckless, Marcus replied. That's Harold. I said. By 8 a.m., Evan confirmed what we expected. The sweep had tripped an internal integrity check, one I'd insisted on after the Singapore deal. It didn't block access, it simply copied it. Quietly, completely. Harold was collecting data, so were we. At 9:15, Claire forwarded a memo from compliance. Subject line, preliminary anomalies. Identified, no accusations, no conclusions, just a request for clarification on authorization chains. Harold ignored it. By 10, the board's secure channel lit up with confusion. Two directors asked why certain approvals now showed conflicting timestamps. A third requested a freeze until clarity is restored. That was the word again. Clarity. Harold called me at 10:23. I let it ring. When I finally answered, his voice was controlled but tight. You're interfering. No, I said. Your systems are. You think you're clever, he snapped. This company exists because of me. It exists despite you, I replied. Silence. You're forcing my hand, he said. I looked at Lena. She nodded. The mirror logs were complete. Do what you need to do, I said calmly. So will I. He hung up. At 11:30, the first external inquiry arrived not from regulators, but from a banking partner requesting confirmation of authority after detecting unusual internal movements. Evan smiled when he saw it. Third-party verification. He said, He can't override that. By midday, Harold's office was in controlled chaos. Meetings canceled, advisors waiting, phones ringing unanswered. The confidence he relied on was dissolving into reaction. Daniel texted once, This is spiraling. I didn't reply. By late afternoon, Claire made the call we'd been waiting for. Compliance escalation is no longer optional, she said. The system flagged executive override patterns. That triggers mandatory disclosure. Timeline I asked, 48 hours, maybe less. I stepped onto the balcony, letting the city noise rise and fall. Somewhere across town, Harold Whitmore was trying to reassert control through pressure, through command, through force. But systems don't respond to force. They respond to logic. Behind me, the team worked in steady silence, 22 people who understood that the most devastating outcomes are never loud. They're documented. Harold thought authority protected him. He forgot that authority leaves fingerprints, and fingerprints tell stories. Stories that don't need witnesses, just time. By the next morning, Harold Whitmore had stopped calling. That was how I knew things were no longer under his control. At 8:10 a.m., Claire sent a single line to the group board council has entered the channel. No panic, no commentary, just a fact. When lawyers show up without announcements, it means someone finally read the documents. Evan followed with a screenshot. 3 financial partners had flagged temporary review holds, not freezes, not accusations. The kind of pause that tells executives their credibility is now conditional. Marcus reported from the floor. People are being asked to resubmit approvals they've already filed. Harold's office wants confirmations in writing. I nodded. They're looking for someone else to blame. That instinct never fails. By mid-morning, the board convened without Harold. That detail mattered. He'd always insisted on chairing every session, framing it as leadership. In reality, it was surveillance. Today, he was unavailable. According to his assistant, the board didn't wait. Daniel called again, his voice barely holding together. They're asking questions about Dad's overrides, about why compliance wasn't looped in. They should. I said, "You planned this. I prepared for it. I corrected." "There's a difference." He exhaled sharply. "They want to speak to you. Then they know where to find me." The request arrived formally at 12:40 p.m., an invitation to a closed session with independent counsel present. Not a hearing, not an interrogation, an assessment. Harold would hate that word. It implies neutrality. Lena looked up from her screen. "Do we go yes?" I said, but not alone. When we arrived, the room felt different from before, less polished, more careful, files stacked instead of tablets, eyes watching reactions instead of waiting for commands. Harold wasn't there. The lead counsel spoke first. "We're reviewing executive actions taken under emergency authority." "Which emergency?" I asked calmly. He paused. "That's part of the issue. We laid everything out, not emotionally, not defensively, just timelines, dependencies, internal controls triggered by Harold's own decisions." The counsel listened. The directors asked fewer questions than expected. That, too, was telling. By 3 p.m., the board issued a temporary directive: all executive overrides suspended pending review. Authority redistributed to committee oversight. Harold Whitmore was officially sidelined. Daniel met me in the hallway afterward. His confidence was gone now, replaced by something quieter. "He didn't think you'd let it go this far." He said, "I didn't let it." I replied, "He pushed it." That evening, news outlets picked up whispers, not headlines, just mentions. Internal governance review, leadership scrutiny, the kind of language that scares investors more than accusations. Back at the apartment, the team gathered again. No celebration, no relief. "This isn't over," Marcus said. "No?" I agreed. But it's no longer his. Harold Whitmore had built power by standing at the center of everything. Now, everything had learned how to move without him. And systems, once they adapt, rarely go back. The summons didn't come from Harold. That alone told me everything. At 9:00 a.m., an assistant from the board sent a neutral calendar invite: executive review, attendance required. No names attached, no agenda, just a location. The same top-floor conference room where Harold used to preside. Confident and untouchable. When I arrived, the room felt unfamiliar, not because the furniture had changed, but because the center of gravity had. Harold sat near the window now. Not at the head. His posture was rigid, his hands folded too tightly. Across from him were 3 board members, independent counsel, and a compliance officer I didn't recognize. Daniel stood behind his chair, silent. The chair at the head of the table was empty. The counsel began without ceremony. "We're here to clarify discrepancies identified during the recent systems review." Harold leaned forward. "This is unnecessary. I've already explained." The counsel raised a hand. "You'll have time to respond." That interruption landed harder than any accusation. They walked through it methodically. Authorization chains that bypassed policy. Emergency powers invoked without documented cause. Data sweeps executed without legal sign-off. Each point delivered without judgment. Just evidence. When it was my turn, I didn't speak about motives. I spoke about design. I explained why redundancies existed, why mirrors were placed, why approvals required multiple timestamps. Every safeguard Harold had once dismissed as over-engineering was now a quiet witness. "This isn't sabotage," I said calmly. "It's resilience." Harold finally turned to me. "You built these systems to undermine me." "No," I replied. "I built them to survive you." The room went still. The compliance officer cleared her throat. "At this stage, executive authority remains suspended pending external review." Harold's jaw tightened. "You're removing me based on assumptions." The council didn't flinch. "We're pausing you based on patterns." That distinction mattered. By 11:30, the decision was formalized. Harold was placed on temporary administrative leave, access restricted, communications monitored, not punishment containment. Daniel looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. This didn't have to end like this. It didn't have to start the way it did. I said, outside. Cameras waited, not aggressively, curiously. A single question floated through the crowd. "Is the CEO stepping down?" No one answered. That afternoon, the board issued a statement measured, cautious, leadership continuity assured, operations stable, investigation ongoing. Markets reacted not with panic, but recalibration. Back at the apartment, the team gathered again. There was no cheering, just a shared exhale. "This is the point of no return," Lena said. "Yes." I agreed. For him. Evan checked his phone. External auditors confirmed. "They're in." Marcus nodded. "Once that door opens, it doesn't close quietly." I stepped to the window, watching the city settle into evening. Harold Whitmore had finally been forced into a room where authority didn't matter, only records did. He had spent decades controlling outcomes. Now, outcomes were controlling him, and the next phase wouldn't belong to either of us. It would belong to the truth. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in layers. By the next morning, the auditors had taken over 2 floors of the building. Not loudly, not dramatically. They moved with the calm efficiency of people who already knew what they were looking for. Laptops open, boxes labeled, access logs mirrored. Harold Whitmore's name began disappearing from internal systems, not erased, just archived. A subtle shift that signaled something final. Daniel came to see me again. This time without anger, without demands. "They're asking about Dad's personal authorizations," he said quietly. "About accounts I didn't even know existed." I studied his face, for the first time. He looked like someone standing outside the shelter of power. "You grew up believing control was love." I said, "So did he." He nodded once. "And you, I learned that control is temporary." The board reconvened at 3 p.m., this time with fewer voices and more documents. Independent counsel presented preliminary findings, careful language, but unmistakable direction. Patterns of override, repeated circumvention, personal discretion replacing governance. No accusations yet, but no denials either. By evening, the first resignation arrived. A senior advisor who'd signed off on Harold's emergency measures stepped down to preserve institutional trust. Another followed before midnight. Evan texted a single word, unraveling. I returned to the apartment late. The city quieter than usual. Lena was already there, packing up files we no longer needed. "Do you ever wonder if this was worth it?" she asked softly. I considered the question longer than I expected. "Yes," I said, which is how I know it was. Winning without doubt is just domination. This felt different, heavier, real. The next morning, Harold